Chapter 10, Section 1, the work of Gregor Mendel. Learning objectives: explain from where an organism gets its unique characteristics. Explain how different forms of a gene are distributed to offspring. Every living thing, plant or animal, microbe or human being, has a set of characteristics inherited from its parents or parent. Since the beginning of recorded history, people have wanted to understand how inheritance is passed from one generation to the next. The scientific study of biological inheritance is called genetics. The modern science of genetics began with the work of an Austrian scientist and priest named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was born in 1822 in what is now the Czech Republic. After studying science and mathematics at the University of Vienna, he spent the next 14 years working in a monastery and teaching local students. In addition to his teaching duties, Mendel was in charge of the monastery garden. In this simple garden, he was able to do the work that changed biology forever. Mendel carried out his work with ordinary pea plants, partly because peas are small, easy to grow, and can produce hundreds of offspring. Mendel knew that part of each flower produced pollen grains containing the male reproductive cells, or sperm. Similarly, he knew that the female portion of each flower produces reproductive cells called eggs. During sexual reproduction, male and female reproductive cells join in the process known as fertilization to produce a new cell. In peas, this new cell develops into a tiny embryo encased within a seed. Pea flowers are normally mostly self-pollinating, which means that sperm fertilize egg cells from within the same flower. A plant grown from a seed produced by self-pollination inherits all of its characteristics from the single parent that bore it. It has a single parent. Mendel's monastery garden had several stocks of pea plants. These pea plants were true breeding, meaning that they were self-pollinating and produced offspring with traits identical to themselves. A trait is a specific characteristic like seed color or plant height. One stock of Mendel peas produced only tall plants, while the other produced only short ones. One produced only green seeds and the other produced only yellow seeds. Mendel examined 7 different traits of pea plants. Each of these 7 traits had 2 contrasting characteristics, such as a green or yellow pod color. Mendel crossed plants with each of the 7 contrasting characteristics and then studied their offspring. The offspring of crosses between parents with different contrasting characteristics are called hybrids. Mendel decided to cross his stocks of true breeding plants. That is, he caused one plant to reproduce with another plant. To do this, he prevented self-pollinating by cutting away the pollen-bearing male parts of the flower. He then dusted pollen from a different plant onto the female part of that flower. This is called cross-pollination. When Mendel crossed plants with contrasting traits, the resulting hybrids had the traits of only one of the parents. When doing genetic crosses, we call the original pair of plants the pea or parental generation. Their offspring are called the F1 or first filial generation. Filius or filia are the Latin words for son or daughter. What were Mendel's F1 hybrid plants like? To his surprise, for each trait studied, the offspring had the characteristic of only one of its parents. In each cross, the nature of the other parent with regard to each trait seemed to have disappeared. From these traits, Mendel drew 2 conclusions. His first conclusion formed the basis of our current understanding of inheritance. An individual's characteristics are determined by factors that are passed from one parental generation to the next. Today, we call these factors genes. Each of the traits Mendel studies was controlled by a single gene that occurred in two contrasting varieties. These varieties produced different expressions or forms of each trait. For example, one form of the gene for height produced tall plants and the other produced short plants. The different forms of a single gene are called alleles. Mendel's second conclusion is called the principle of dominance. The principle states that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. An organism with both a dominant allele and a recessive allele for a particular trait will exhibit the dominant characteristic. For example, Mendel found that the allele for green pods was dominant over the recessive allele for yellow pods. He also found that the allele for tall plants was dominant over the recessive allele for short plants. This picture shows you the 7 characteristics that Mendel crossed and the outcomes of the F1 generation. Mendel didn't just stop after crossing the parent plants because he had another question. Had the recessive allele simply disappeared, or were they still present in the new plant? To find out, he allowed all 7 kinds of F1 hybrids to self-pollinate. In effect, Mendel crossed the F1 generation with itself to produce an F2, or second filial generation. When Mendel examined the F2 plants, he made a remarkable discovery. Traits produced by the recessive allele reappeared in the second generation roughly 1/4 of the time. To begin with, Mendel assumed that a dominant allele had masked the corresponding recessive allele in the F1 generation. However, the trait controlled by the recessive allele did show up in some of the F2 plants. This reappearance indicated that at some point the allele for yellow pods had separated from the allele from green pods. How did this separation or segregation of alleles occur? Mendel suggested that the alleles for green pods and yellow pods in the F1 plant must have segregated from each other during the formation of reproductive cells, or gametes. Let's assume, as Mendel might have, that the F1 plants inherited an allele for green pods from one green parent and one for yellow pods from the yellow parent. Because the allele for green pods is dominant, all the F1 plants have green pods. During gamete formation, the alleles for each gene segregate from each other so that each gamete carries only one allele for the gene. Thus, each F1 plant produces 2 kinds of gametes, those with green pod allele and those with yellow pod allele. Alleles separate during gamete formation and then pair up again in the F2 generation. A capital letter represents a dominant allele. A lowercase letter represents a recessive allele. Now we can see why the recessive trait for yellow pods, which is a lowercase g, reappeared in Mendel's F2 generation. Each F1 plant in Mendel's cross produced 2 kinds of gametes, those with the allele for green pods and those with the allele for yellow pods. For green pods, it's represented by a big G.